Welcome, my friend, to The Whym. My name is Jonathan Sorcy, author of the Tales from the Whym. In just a few moments, we'll get into this podcast's first story. But before that, I want to give you a very brief explanation of The Whym. The Whym is a collection of floating worlds which lie just under the edge of what geographers have charted. These worlds are filled with the strange and beautiful, with peril and with promise, and in general the sorts of things that make for good and unexpected stories. If you enjoy this episode, or would prefer to read rather than listen, there are many more Whym stories available at wanderingthewhym.wordpress.com. Whenever I finish a new story, it will be released there first, before eventually making its way here in audio form. The blog site is also home to shorter snippet pieces, such as poems and encyclopedia entries, which are not as well suited to a podcast format. But enough on technicalities. You've come here for a story, and so here it is. The title of this piece is Beams from Beyond. Kent stopped mid-stride, almost tripping on the cobblestone walkway in his sudden halt. Rewinding his long legs, he stepped back a half-pace to look at the storefront which had caught his attention. A sign painted on the window in deep letters of red and gold said, "Master Thromwink's Magical Items and Mutables." This must have been the place which the seedmonger had recommended to him. Kent thought a moment and consulted his watch. He needed to depart soon in order to be on time for dinner. Aisling was making a favourite of his that night, and he had promised her that he would not be late. Of course, he had also promised her that he would bring back something special for their garden. It was a good 2 hours' ride from their homestead to Elledge, the nearest city, and Kent did not often make the trip. He certainly wouldn't make it again before the prime planting season was over. Kent stepped up to the door and put his hand on the knob, but hesitated. "What?" he said aloud. "Bizarre." A small sign on the door listed the hours of Master Thromwink's shop, from 6 o'clock in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Who would close a shop so early? Kent wondered. It was only a few minutes to 3 now. Fiddling with his wedding ring, he pulled the door open and stepped inside. He would just have to be quick, he resolved. Unfortunately, that was something he was not particularly skilled at being. The shop was fairly narrow, but stretched back a long distance, with several masses of bookshelves, coat-racks, and wardrobes obscuring exactly how far. The whole place seemed like a large jumble of slightly organized furniture and haggle-paggle. Oddly, Kent did not see Master Thromwink anywhere, nor a counter or table of any sort for him to man. "Hello?" called Kent. "Master Thromwink! Is anyone here?" There was no response. But Kent thought he heard something toward the back of the shop, like feet shuffling or marbles rattling. Kent reached into his pocket and felt the seed package which he had purchased earlier, evaluating for a moment. The most interesting thing he had been able to find at the seedmonger's was a type of goldenrod squibulon. It was an interesting find, but something told him that it was not quite what Aisling was looking for. Squibulons were very hearty vegetables, but they were not very majestic or magical, and they were a bit lumpy even for Kent's tastes. He recalled the look in his wife's eyes when she had told him about her plans for the garden. "I'd like something special," she had said, "to go over there. Something unique." Her tone was wishful, and he had the feeling that she knew exactly what she wanted, even if she could not express it, or that she would know when she saw it. Just as a dream, long forgotten, comes back suddenly when you see something that once appeared in it. Kent crumpled the squibulon package slightly, reaffirmed in his quest. He would not leave empty-handed just yet. Thromwink was probably simply tucked in a back corner somewhere, computing income for the day. The deeper Kent wandered into the store, the stranger it became. He had passed from sections which held mainly furniture to ones that were all alembics, and then to a shelf of just hornigos, all with their shells still on and quite unpolished. There were bins of blobs and tubs of turks, baskets of trimmels and caskets of yordinks, and there was a tremendously large tank filled with liquid blotch, in which a living eidernop was meandering. Unfortunately, he did not see any seeds, however. He called again for Master Thromwink. Silence. And then a loud, sharp noise, like a door snapping shut. It was a door shutting. With a start, Kent ran back to the front of the store. He grabbed the doorknob and found that it was locked. There was no button with which to unlock it from the inside, only a keyhole. Quickly, he scrambled past some furniture, stepped on some toy soldiers, and broke them, I'm afraid, and peered out of the shop window. A crotchety old man walked slowly away from the door. Kent rapped on the window, but it was no use. He watched him slowly disappear around a corner. Kent turned to look for anyone else who might be walking down the street. But quite suddenly, the whole window turned squid black. It gave Kent such a start that he fell backwards from where he had been balancing on one leg, and crunched a poor old stool which happened to be there. There must have been some sort of spell on the window to tint it as an anti-theft precaution. Well, he was not going to let a darkened window and a locked doorknob keep him in, not when it meant he would have to miss Aisling's spaghetti, and worry her half to death besides. She was not prone to worrying, it was true, but the thought of worrying her worried him terribly. Kent entered the mess of merchandise and returned a few moments later with a long, oddly shaped fire poker. He slipped the hook part of it around the doorknob and prepared to wrench it off with the extra leverage. He figured he could find Thromwink and pay for the damage. But as soon as he began to put pressure on the knob, he jumped about 10 feet into the air, banging his head on the ceiling, and dropped the poker. In a flash, some sort of magical shock had slithered down the poker and bitten him quite harshly on the wrist. Of course, he thought, more anti-theft enchantments. This left Kent one option before he could seriously consider panicking. He began searching around the shop for any sort of smaller window which might have a latch, or for any other exit to the building. But the few windows he did find were all tiny, or else quite impossibly sealed. Master Thromwink evidently took his shop's security quite seriously, and afforded no half-measures. Kent was, indeed, locked in. A large lump of panic tried to float up his esophagus, but he took a deep breath and pushed it down. He had done all that he could, and now getting riled up would not help him. In any case, if he thought calmly for a while, he might invent some new ideas about how to escape. And if that failed, he could at least pass the time looking for the seeds that had brought him there in the first place. This would keep his mind from thinking about Aisling, and how much she might be worried about him, or about the spaghetti growing cold on his plate. He resolved to sit down for a bit, since he had been on his feet for the past few hours, and think of some other way of getting out. But there were, of course, no chairs in the main room of the shop, except for the stool which he had managed to break. Kent thought he had seen a chair somewhere near the blotch tank, so he went back in that direction. He got turned around twice before finding it again, but at last returned to the tank, and found the chair beside it. At first glance, it seemed a perfectly ordinary chair, with a high, straight back, and a rather grand red-cushioned seat. Upon closer inspection, though, it had a very odd look, which Kent could not quite put his finger on. It was as if it were tilted, or too high, or low, or that it had a fifth leg, but none of these seemed to be, in fact, the case. Shrugging, Kent resolved to give it the final test. He sat on it, and nothing happened. It felt perfectly fine. He sat thinking a few moments, but soon found that it was very difficult to concentrate, what with the Eidernop eyeing him from the tank, and 1,000 other strange and wondrous pieces of bric-a-brac pleading for his interest. Shutting them out, he closed his eyes. As soon as he did, however, he was overcome by a curious sensation, and opened them again. Perplexed, Kent looked around for a moment, but everything seemed just as it had been a moment ago. He closed his eyes a second time. Once again, he felt as though he was falling. He moved his feet to feel the floor, and felt nothing. His eyelids flew open involuntarily, but he was still in the chair in the shop. "Something very strange is going on," he said aloud, rubbing his beardless chin. He resolved to experiment. Standing up, he closed his eyes. He did not notice the sensation now, and could feel his feet firmly on the floor. So he sat down, resolving to try again and see how long the sensation would last, or if anything else would happen. This time he held his eyes shut, even as a slight butterfly sensation rose inside him. He was falling again. After a moment, he breathed deeply and managed to relax a little. Somehow, with his eyes still shut, he managed to look downwards, and saw his body, as well as the chair he was sitting in. But all around him was absolute blackness. Carefully, he reached an arm out and could feel the air as he fell. Kent looked upwards and thought he saw a tiny point of light far away. Suddenly, a wave of heat hit him. With a shock, Kent opened his eyes. Still in the shop room. He shook his head. He had to stop doing that. He wanted to find out what sort of strange, plummetous journey the chair was taking him on, and more importantly, whether there was some way that he could get out or call for help using it. He wondered whether, when he closed his eyes, he would be right back where he was when the heat had struck him, or whether he would have kept falling in that other place, while his eyes were open here. He glanced at his watch and committed the time to memory. When he opened his eyes next, he could see whether time passed strangely or not. But when he returned to the closed pit, as he had begun to think of it, he felt cold. Everything seemed just as it had the first time he had found himself there. The point of light above him, however, seemed perhaps a little larger. He watched it for a moment, and it shrank very slowly. Then the heat hit him again. Gazing downwards, he saw an enormous ring of flames, like they would have at a circus, suspended in the air below him. All was darkness around it and him, but he could see and feel it clearly. Suddenly he realized that the chair was leaning forward. Somehow he was not falling straight downwards. As the chair leaned, he began to move at an angle, shooting towards the fiery ring. Very soon he lost all sense of direction, however. The chair continued to move, as if it was very carefully piloting his fall, steering him right for the center of the ring, which also seemed to be moving, or rotating. It grew hotter and hotter, until finally Kent shot through the middle of the fire. He was no longer falling, but shooting straight forwards, unless his senses completely deceived him. He thought he could hear something, like a bell far away, or like strange laughter. The darkness returned, no longer chased away by the red light of the fire. Kent wondered if he would see anything else. He had almost forgotten about Aisling when he saw the first ring, but now thoughts of her streamed back to him. He was just about to open his eyes so that he could focus on trying to get out of the shop, when he saw something in the distance again. As it grew closer, he realized it was another ring of fire. Once again the chair steered towards it, and Kent gripped onto its arms to avoid sliding off accidentally as it turned and tilted. He passed through this ring just as he had the first, only this time he heard something which sounded far stranger. It was the hiss of a snake, followed by a sort of scuttling noise, like that of a giant insect. Kent wondered what this might mean, but he thought that he probably did not truly want to find out. Over the next few minutes, or what felt like it, he encountered another 2 rings of flame, passing through both just as he had the first 2. The third made the sound of a door squeaking open, and of a parrot. The fourth, meanwhile, was only a sort of a deep bellow, the sort that Kent imagined the ground itself might make, if it could, followed by 2 rocks clacking together. When he had passed the 4th ring, he saw something else in the distance, below him and a ways off. As he had begun to think of the chair as a sort of companion on this strange ride, neared it, he saw that it was a door, and a very elaborate door at that. It had gold leaf all around, and elegant little red and white ivory carvings of plump babies riding yordninks and other strange beasts, and of snakes, of grape bunches, and of a very large cat. At the very top of the door was something which puzzled Kent for a long moment, but finally he realized what it was. The bottom lip and chin of a person, attached to the most magnificent beard he had ever seen. It was so stupendous, so singular, in fact, that he found he could not really describe it to people afterwards, except to say that it was the beard. All of this detail Kent could see as he approached the door, for, as he soon realized, the door was incredibly large. Vast was probably a better word. It was larger than his house, of that he felt certain. He had the feeling that he was meant to go through it, but he did not know whether it would open when they arrived at it, or, if not, how he would ever manage to reach the tremendous doorknob. The chair slowed as they neared the door, floating closer and closer until it stopped just before its base, only a few feet away. Kent found that his feet were on a solid stone pavement, which he could not see before. He stood and approached the door. Within the massive reliefs he had seen from afar were smaller reliefs, and within those were still smaller details, sculpted of ivory and gold and porphyry. He studied them for a moment, but quickly realized that if he allowed himself to truly get distracted here, he might never be able to tear himself away, which was, in fact, quite possibly why the door was put there to begin with. Kent found, to his surprise, that there was a small doorknob almost directly in front of the place the chair had landed. This confused him, for it certainly could not have been for the entire door. Having nothing to lose, however, he turned it and tugged. Immediately, lines showed on the wall before him, revealing a much smaller wicket door, which opened smoothly without a sound. Inside, Kent found a tremendous room. Again, for years afterwards, he was at a loss to describe how truly large it was. Nothing could really convey its scale and grandeur. He could see immediately that it was a great feasting hall. In its center was a single long table, which stretched as far as he could see. It branched and forked in various places, and went in strange directions, and even climbed at some points to heights which could only be reached by a special staircase. All around the table were chairs, and these chairs, Kent realized, were very similar to the one which had brought him there. At each chair a place was set with fine china and goldenware, and 3 or 4 glasses of different sizes and curious shapes. The place settings seemed to simultaneously be of the same set, and yet nothing alike. It was as if they were chosen for a specific person or creature who would be sitting there. The tablecloth was woven to show various scenes which seemed to be from a history that Kent had once heard but had forgotten, or which he had never known, but seemed strangely familiar to him. One of the characters, he was certain, was named Ugarth, but that was all he could remember. Kent was, as far as he could tell, the only person in the hall, though he soon found that he was not, in fact, the only one. As he wandered around the table, looking here and there at curious things, he almost stepped on something, on someone. It was the tiniest kitten he had ever seen. It sat and squinted at him for a moment, then let out a little squeak. Kent at once scooped it up and nestled it close to him, for it was the sort of creature that only those of either a very strong will or a very evil heart can resist. "I wonder where your mother is," Kent said, ruffling its fur lovingly. Something told Kent that he would not like to find out. It was a very grand place, and did not feel evil, but it also did not feel particularly safe. He reassured himself with the thought that he could simply open his eyes whenever he chose and reappear in the magic shop. He began to take another step, but suddenly the kitten coughed. Something flew out of its mouth and skittered across the floor. It coughed again, and then twice more. 2 more somethings fell. Kent stooped to examine them, and found that they were beans. He picked them up and examined them. They almost seemed to be made of crystal, or of a muted opal, but after a moment they looked merely like ordinary beans, and nothing more. They smelled slightly of popcorn, however, and glinted when under the right light. "I wonder if they'll grow," said Kent. Suddenly, a noise echoed across the room. It sounded like links in a chain, clinking. Following this, there was a cruel laugh. Kent decided that it was time to leave. He stuffed the beans into his pocket, and then opened his eyes. Except he found that he could not, or that they were already open, and he was here, not in the shop. He heard a door open and footsteps follow. He panicked for a moment, looking wildly for somewhere to hide. But then he remembered the chair. Of course! He turned and dashed back, stooping to about the level of the table, and trying not to jostle the kitten. Voices began to fill the hall. He reached the door. A trumpet blared. He did not look back. Kent slipped through the wicket and closed it as softly and quickly as he could. The kitten mewed as he sat in the chair, which suddenly creaked as if it were under a great weight. Kent grimaced. Of course. It was a magic chair, and might not function well with a cat so near it. Yet it was a very young and very small cat, and perhaps its anti-magic was not yet full grown. In any case, he could not bring himself to set the little creature down. Taking a deep breath, he opened his eyes, and found himself, once again, in the magician's shop. He smiled triumphantly, but before he could rise, the chair groaned and broke under him. He hoped it was not expensive. When Kent arrived back home, Aisling hugged him so hard and so long he thought he might suffocate. She almost quite smothered little Beans, which is what Kent decided to call the kitten, before she realized he was there. Aisling had been awake most of the night worrying about Kent, even though she was not prone to that, and Kent apologized most profusely. She asked him how he intended to explain himself, and he related the story of his strange experience to her. She was almost tempted not to believe him, though she knew that he did not lie, and after all he had brought back the beans as proof. These beans they eventually planted in the garden, at the opposite end from the squibbulons, which Aisling was indeed unenthused by. Over the next few years, the beans grew into a very large plant, almost like a tree, though different from anything they had seen before. It produced a strange sort of nut, which was very difficult to crack open, but well worth the effort. It tasted better than any nut they had ever had, which was perhaps a low bar to clear, for Kent was allergic to other nuts, but found that he could eat these bean nuts. Aisling soon began using them to make a special sort of cake, for which she became well known in later years. Kent never could figure quite where he had been to on that strange magic chair. He had tried to ask Thromwink about it, but the old man had not been much help after he heard that his chair was smashed. He kept on muttering, "Broken! Oh, broken!" Kent could not even get a price for the merchandise out of him, and so pressed a reasonable amount of cash into his palm and left quickly. Eventually, Kent developed some theories of his own about where he had been. He did not like to repeat these, however, unconfirmed and strange as they were. Yet he was quite open after that with his opinions on not frequenting magic shops, especially not close to their closing times. The End. Thank you so much for listening to today's story from the Whym. I hope you will consider sharing this podcast with your friends or family. I'm Jonathan Sorsey, and I will see you at the next crossroads. Until then, farewell, and don't let the Naramites nibble.